In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of a weekend trip and start teaching you how to become a weekend warrior. Now, this may be something that you're not entirely familiar with, especially if you go to a better known school where it's not really too common for people to do this. I've found that it's really more people who go to business schools or undergraduate institutions that a lot of banks don't recruit at, and where they actually find an extensive networking effort like this helpful. And actually being in a city, whether it's New York or San Francisco or London, for a weekend or maybe several weekends, or possibly even several weeks, can actually really help them out with their networking efforts far more than just going through the normal channels at school. So those types of candidates tend to be a little bit more familiar with the concept of a weekend trip, but regardless of your background, I think a weekend trip can be really, really valuable, and you should definitely make it a part of your recruiting efforts. So just to start off with the motivation for making weekend trips right here, I think there's a whole host of reasons that these can be very useful, but the three reasons that immediately popped into my mind were these. First off, meeting people in person is always a lot more powerful than the phone. The order that I generally rank these in is that in person is far and away the best method. I would say it's at least 10 times as effective as the phone. Then the phone, of course, is more effective than email because you can actually hear the other person's voice, they can hear your voice, they'll feel more of a connection with you. And email is okay in certain circumstances, but if you want to develop real relationships with people, you really need to meet in person because you just understand so much more from body language and from what they say. You get an opportunity to get introduced to some of their colleagues. Maybe you'll have the chance to meet other people at their bank or walk around their office. And then the other related reason that I think weekend trips can be so helpful is that you get in a lot of networking, practicing, and learning in a very short period of time. So in the span of a few days to maybe a week or so, you're going to be meeting with dozens of people. You'll go through a lot of informational interviews, possibly even real interviews. And it's just the fastest way to not only get good at networking, but also get good at real interviews and even potentially polish your resume in the process. So it's a period of really accelerated learning. And it's difficult to replicate this if you're just doing networking over the phone or via email, for example. Then the other reason, and this actually plays into some of what I was saying before, is that what I call strength in numbers. So basically what I mean here is that when you go through a weekend trip or even a week trip, if you want to call it that, you can meet with, again, maybe 5 to 10 people in a single day, and then each of those meetings could potentially lead to you being introduced to some of their colleagues, other people in their office. It could lead to you getting tours of their office if they really like you. It could lead to you getting referrals to MDs or maybe even referrals to their friends at other firms. And so it's just a really good way to network and to meet a lot of people in a very short period of time. And to not only meet a lot of people, but to also make a strong first impression on them and establish very solid relationships from the start. And again, it's just much more difficult to do this over the phone and via email. It's possible, and I've seen people succeed with cold calling. I've seen people succeed with just informational interviews set up over the phone, but ultimately, you're going to form much stronger relationships if you actually go in person and speak with people there, as opposed to keeping all your communication electronic or long distance. And then finally, oftentimes these weekend trips can actually be really good practice for real interviews. And in some cases, they can actually turn into real interviews depending on how close it is to the recruiting season. So I've seen that in a lot of cases, the closer it gets to recruiting season, the more these types of informational interviews actually turn into real interviews and can often result in you getting real interviews at the firm on an accelerated schedule or potentially even getting offers very quickly, faster than other people if they like you enough. So these are the three main reasons I would strongly recommend doing weekend trips. And again, you may not be too familiar with these depending on your background, but they're really, really helpful. And we're going to get into some of the key considerations now that you have to take into account when planning these, and then we'll go into the actual logistics of how you go about planning these and the things you need to keep in mind. So again, I think there are basically three main considerations that you need to keep in mind with weekend trips. The first one is the time slash the timing. And what I mean by this is you need to figure out not only when you're going to plan your weekend trips, but also how many weekend trips you're going to do. I think at least one would be highly useful for virtually anyone. Beyond that, it's really up to you. I think if you get into the realm of doing 5 to 10 weekend trips. That's probably a bit excessive unless you really want to do that, or unless you just happen to actually live in New York or London, for example, and transportation is not an issue or anything. But in addition to all that, you also need to think about the actual timing. So, how close do you schedule this to recruiting season? What days do you select to meet people? So we say weekend trip here, but should you really meet with people on Saturday and Sunday, or should it be a Thursday, Friday, Saturday type thing, or what kind of arrangement is optimal for this type of situation? And we'll get into the details and how to think about some of that and how to make decisions on that in a little bit. And then the second point you need to really consider is the expense, because these trips are not inexpensive, especially if you have to fly to New York or fly to San Francisco or London or Hong Kong. You have to pay for the flight itself. You might have to pay for a hotel room if you don't know anyone in the city that you're going to visit. You have to pay for meals and transportation within the city. It can be a big issue, especially in places like London that are already expensive to begin with, and then also in places like LA, for example, where public transportation is a little spotty and you usually have to either rent a car or have a friend help you out or something like that. So the expense can definitely be an issue. And so we'll look at some ways to think about that and ways that you can possibly reduce this and make the whole process more efficient and more doable. And then finally, the logistics. And what I mean here is you have to be very careful about how you actually set up meetings for these types of weekend trips, how many meetings you schedule back to back with each other, and what days you pick, how many meetings you request, and then how many you actually follow through with. Because you have to give yourself some buffer time in case things don't work out. You have to plan for emergencies or accidents if people back out at the last minute, which is not uncommon, especially since you're dealing with investment bankers here who often have last minute obligations. Things always come up seemingly at the last minute and they get pulled away to do something else. And so we're going to be going over a few ways to think through that and some of the key considerations for logistics and how you get around some of the difficulties that I just brought up. So the first point here on the time and the timing. So in terms of how many trips to take, it's really up to you, but I would say from my experience interviewing people who have done this and from friends who have done this, I would say that at least one trip is really good. I think 2 trips, you could definitely make an argument for that. I think when you get to 3, 4, 5 trips, somewhere in that range, it starts to get a little excessive unless you have a really, really good reason to do it. In terms of the actual timing here, there are a couple different ways to think about this. I've talked to people who have saved their weekend trip until right before recruiting begins. I've talked to others who have done it earlier on. So let's say, for example, that you're targeting summer internship recruiting season, which starts in December, continues through January and February in most cases. So if you're in that position, then one strategy here would be to do one weekend trip in September or October, and then to do another weekend trip in maybe November or December as the recruiting season is starting up. And then if you really want to do a third one, maybe you could make it during actual interview season. So you could be going around to interview at different firms, and then you could also be networking on the side with other firms while you're doing that. So that would be one way to approach the timing here. Of course, you don't have to do 3 trips like I just suggested. I think, again, depending on your goals and what school you're at and how much networking you've already done, that may or may not be excessive. Again, keeping in mind that these trips do cost a lot of time and money to do, so you have to properly take advantage of them. But I would say that the suggestions that I just gave with maybe trying to schedule one trip for earlier in the recruiting season, maybe a couple months before it starts up, and then another trip for further down the road, maybe something in the weeks or maybe a month before recruiting and interviews actually start would be a good idea. And your strategy there should be that in the first weekend trip, you kind of want to introduce yourself to people, get to know others in the industry, get referrals, things like that. And then the one right before recruiting begins, you want to make sure that you're on the interview list at all these different places. So that should be your overall strategy in terms of picking how many trips you go on and deciding what the purpose of each trip is going to be. The other point I want to bring up here is that these informational interviews during weekend trips tend to work better if you've already established some kind of relationship with someone. So it works better if you've communicated at least via email or over the phone first. You can blindly contact someone and suggest a meeting, but I found that generally a good strategy might be that during the spring or summer before recruiting begins, you start reaching out to people, setting up informational interviews on the phone, emailing them, staying in touch, and then when it comes time for recruiting, you let them know about your early trip, maybe in September or October. And then as you go through that, you get to meet other people like that. And then you follow up with the contacts that you knew from the spring or summer. As you get into the winter, you follow up with the new people that you met, and you try to stay in touch with everyone and meet as many as you can on your final weekend trip before interview season actually starts. So that's one way you could go through it. Of course, you don't need to follow this exactly, do what works for you, but this is just kind of a general outline that I found worked for a lot of people when I interviewed those who successfully networked into investment banking. Another consideration is you need to figure out what dates and specifically what days you want to be doing these informational interviews. So we've labeled this whole course Becoming a Weekend Warrior. So you might think that maybe the optimal schedule is to do everything on Saturday or Sunday because you don't have to go to class, you don't have work if you're working full time. But I would say that that's actually probably not the best idea here. I would say that usually what you want to do is schedule your trip so that it lasts from maybe Thursday or Friday through Sunday, and then Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, or Friday and Saturday, for example, are when you actually meet with bankers. And you can put those into blocks, as we'll see in a little bit when we walk through an example of how you do that. But I would say maybe spend 2 or 3 days actually meeting bankers. And then the third or fourth day, which is typically Sunday, you can just relax or head back home or hang out with friends if you have friends in the area. The reason why I'm recommending this is twofold. One is that if you do this for many, many days over and over, you're probably going to get burned out and you may just run out of people to meet if you stay there for too long. And also, it can be more difficult to get in touch with bankers on Sunday in a lot of cases. Definitely senior bankers who sometimes spend the day with their family or watching sports or traveling. And for junior bankers, oftentimes Sunday is when they have to go back into the office. They have to start planning for the next week. They get a lot of work piled on them. I found that Saturday can be good, especially if you're in New York, where a lot of people actually live and work, because they'll tend to still be in the city. And if you meet them in the afternoon, for example, they'll still be around, especially the junior bankers, because they're always on call. They might actually be at the office when you contact them. And then, of course, Thursday and Friday, you also want to be thinking about those because it's sometimes easier to get in touch with the senior bankers then. It can be tricky to get a hold of some of the more senior guys over the weekend, so Thursday, Friday are definitely good days to do this. Morning or afternoon, either one works. I would suggest actually scheduling everything in blocks. So what you might do is try to set up a few informational interviews in the morning one day and then a few informational interviews in the afternoon. It's tricky to schedule night interviews, I've found in a lot of cases, because typically on weekdays, the senior guys will not want to be bothered during the night. And then the junior guys, that's when they actually do their work. So that's when they start cranking away on pitch books and models and other things at night. And then, of course, on weekend nights, usually people want to hang out with their friends. They may not be too receptive to meeting up with you for dinner on Saturday. You could try it if you happen to know someone better or if you've gotten to know them well. It could certainly work, but I would start out by trying to schedule your meetings for the morning or afternoon for the most part. And then in terms of how many meetings you actually want to schedule, how many requests you could send, and what would actually make this trip worthwhile, I would say you want to target at least meeting 5 to 10 people during this trip, if not more than that. Now, to actually do that, you're going to have to request more meetings than that because a lot of people will not get back to you. A lot of people may have something that comes up at the last minute. So always schedule more meetings than you actually need. I would try to schedule at least 10 informational interviews per day. So these can be maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes each. You can have a few in the morning and then the remainder in the afternoon. So I would try to go for at least that. To get the 10 set up on each day, it's difficult to say exactly how many emails and contacts you'll need to send, but I would say assume that at least half the people will either have something come up or just not get back to you. So you might have to send maybe 20 or 30 emails if you decide to make this a Friday, Saturday, Sunday trip to get a sufficient number of informational interviews set up over the weekend. But that's just a general guideline. You don't need to stick to that exactly, but do remember that the more meetings you have, the better because you want to get the most out of this trip. It is expensive to be flying or taking the train or whatever form of transportation you're using to get to this major city. It's expensive if you can't stay with friends. So try to get in as much as you can without burning yourself out. The next issue that comes up with informational interviews and weekend trips like this is the expense. So it's definitely not cheap to be flying into New York or London or whatever city you have to go to. In Europe, it can actually be a little better because there are a lot of discount airlines like Ryanair. So discount and low fare airlines are actually pretty common there. So in Europe, it can actually be better. But in Asia and North America and the Middle East, if you decide to go that route, it can actually be pretty expensive to be flying around. So a couple ways to deal with this. First off, if you have some kind of frequent flyer program or access to it, either through a friend or family member, definitely try to take advantage of that to save on costs. Depending on when you schedule your weekend trips, you may actually be able to get your firm, the firm you're interviewing with, to reimburse you. Now, usually if you do this, it has to be some kind of formal interview. So, for example, if you have a weekend trip right in the middle of recruiting season, you've decided to go that route and actually schedule some of your weekend trips during recruiting season, you may be able to have a firm help out and reimburse you if you can make it look like you flew in specifically to interview with them and then maybe stayed for a day or two to see the city or to hang out with other people. That could be fine, and you'll find that they're actually pretty lenient about what they reimburse. But again, it's hard to pull off unless you have official interviews lined up there. Another option, of course, is to use an alternate form of transportation besides flying there. So if you're close to New York, for example, you could take Amtrak to get there. If you're on the West Coast or in Chicago, again, you could consider trains depending on how close you live to the area. Obviously, if you're in the Midwest and you want to go to New York, for example, a train is not going to be as viable unless you want to spend a couple of days there and do some kind of extended overnight trip. But that is another option if you're really looking to save on expenses. Also, keep in mind that you don't need to stay at the Ritz-Carlton here. So you don't need to stay in a fancy hotel. I would actually strongly recommend staying with friends instead, especially friends who work in finance or really work in anything related to finance in whatever city you're visiting. Because first off, it's going to be a lot cheaper, aka free. And second off, they'll be able to tell you more. They might actually be able to get you referrals to different places. And so I definitely recommend going that route instead and staying with friends, both for the referrals and for all the expense saving you can get in if you do that. Location does matter when you're doing this. So, for example, if you're in New York, you definitely want to be in Manhattan if you're doing this. So, if you have a friend who lives in the Bronx or Queens or something like that, it could potentially work, and you may want to consider it if you're really trying to save on expenses, but it is a little inconvenient. It's not a huge deal if you're out and about during the whole day, which you should be, and if you're also carrying a BlackBerry or iPhone or some kind of mobile device that lets you check your email as you're going along. But keep in mind that location is important, so try to weigh where you're going to be staying versus how much you're actually spending on it before you make any decisions. And then the final thing in terms of expense here is that you really want to get in as many meetings as you can, because if you go and you only have 5 meetings set up over 2 days or 3 days, that's basically a waste of time and money. It's just not going to be enough. Some of those people will definitely end up canceling or backing out at the last minute. So if you're staying there for 2 or 3 days, get at least 10 to 20 meetings set up. Any less than that, and you just run the risk of the whole trip not being worthwhile, which is definitely the biggest waste of money, far more so than paying for the airfare or paying for a hotel if you have to stay there. But in the end, I wouldn't even think of this as an expense. I would think of what you pay for a weekend trip as an investment because you're developing relationships. It's not like you're spending this money on a plasma TV or going out drinking or anything like that. So think of it as an investment instead. Try to save what money you can. Don't spend unnecessarily, but also keep in mind that it is an investment and it's going to be directly helping you in the future. So it's certainly worth a lot more than other huge expenditures you might have made in the past. And then the next point here is concerning logistics. And so what I'm referring to here is on a couple levels. The first point is that you really need to consider the location and the terrain of wherever you're going to be going for these interviews. I have New York displayed right here with Central Park in the middle. But basically my point here is that if you are setting up your schedule such that you're going to some banks that are located in Midtown and then some banks that are located in downtown and then back and forth all the time, if you're in Manhattan, for example, it's very cumbersome and you want to avoid this if at all possible. What I would suggest doing instead is scheduling your meetings so that, for example, all the ones in Midtown are in the morning and then the ones in downtown are in the afternoon. And that way you can reduce your transportation time and make the whole process more efficient. Of course, you need to apply this to whatever city you're going to visit. I would actually bring along a map, bring along something to write with, and make sure you have all the locations of all the banks and all the different people you're going to meet with marked down. Make sure that you have all the organizational stuff taken care of because It sounds stupid, but actually, a lot of this organizational stuff, the logistics, can actually be a big stumbling block with informational interviews because I found that a lot of people don't take it into account at all. You should be taking this into account before you even set up a meeting. You should separate people by which office they work in because you're probably going to be meeting them somewhere close to their office. Separate them by which office they work in, where it's located, and try to batch together all the meetings that are going to be in one area of the city that you'll be visiting. And again, the reason you're doing this is because accidents happen. Accidents happen. Sometimes people just forget about it or they get too busy or they back out at the last minute. So you never know. And I would say in terms of buffer time here, maybe schedule, let's say if you have 3 hours in the morning between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m., maybe schedule three, possibly four meetings for that so that each one lasts for maybe 30 minutes and then you have around 30 minutes of buffer time around each meeting. And then what that lets you do is if someone else backs out, maybe you can make a suggestion to the person to go and visit their office or to get introduced to some other people. And so that way you always have it set up so that you're not completely wasting your time at any point, but you also have enough buffer time to take advantage of any opportunities that may come up along the way. Now, in terms of the actual process for setting up these informational interviews and setting up your weekend trips in general, I think it can be reduced to basically three steps here. The first step is you want to email probably 3 to 4 weeks in advance of when you'll actually be there. It doesn't need to be this long of a lead time. It could be maybe 1 week, 2 week, or 3 weeks. I would say make sure it's at least a week though. So what you want to do is again separate people out by where they're working because you're going to be meeting them close to their offices. Try to figure out which location they're in and try to batch together people who are in different locations so that you're not constantly taking a taxi around the city all the time because that's expensive in terms of both time and money. So figure that out beforehand. Make suggestions to, let's say, maybe 10 people if you want to try to get in 5 meetings in the afternoon. Make suggestions to 10 people that you want to meet. These should usually be contacts that you've already spoken with over the phone or traded emails with at the very least. And then once you've done that, I would follow up just before you actually leave. So maybe a few days before you get there, follow up and say, I just want to follow up on our previous email and confirm that we'll be meeting at this time at this place near your office, for example. And just do this to verify that they'll still be able to do it. Sometimes people forget about it, they don't mark it on their calendars, and so it's always a good idea to do this. And then when you actually get there, it's not really necessary to follow up the day of. Just make sure they have your phone number. Obviously, you should be carrying a mobile phone with you. I think pretty much everyone has a mobile phone, so this shouldn't be an issue. But one thing that could be an issue is you want to make sure you have email access on whatever mobile device you have. So if you have an iPhone, that's fine. Make sure you have email access on it. If you have a BlackBerry, again, just make sure you're checking email on it because you just never know when people are going to cancel or throw something new at you or back out at the last minute or have a change of plans. And sometimes they forget that you'll be traveling around a lot that day. So you want to have a BlackBerry or iPhone or some kind of other mobile device that lets you check email on hand so that you don't get surprised at the last minute. And then a few other thoughts in general on weekend trips and this whole process. One thing that often gets ignored is that these weekend trips can very, very easily lead into not only real interviews, but then also getting offers on an accelerated schedule. This is something that gets overlooked quite a bit, but I've interviewed a lot of people and they've all had this experience to some extent, assuming that they've actually made weekend trips in the first place. Usually, the closer it gets to recruiting season, the more likely it is for this to happen, but keep this in mind because this is one big hidden benefit of actually taking these weekend trips. It is a large time and money commitment, but again, you're going to get great practice for actual interviews. You'll get lots of resume tips along the way. You should, of course, be bringing your resume to all these. That goes without saying. Any type of recruiting event, any type of interview, informational interview, definitely always bring your resume. So you can get a lot of interview practice, you can get a lot of networking practice, and you can even polish your resume in the process of going through all these weekend trips and informational interviews. And then another point here is that you want to try to become a wanderer. And I'm not talking about being a vagabond or anything like that, but let's say that you get invited to someone's office and they start introducing you to people, but they get pulled away or they have to go somewhere. Feel free to wander around and go to different floors, meet people, introduce yourself. Don't be hesitant. And if someone brings it up or says, "Why are you here?" just say, "Oh, I was just visiting someone on the floor above or below. I just got lost temporarily. by the way, I'm so and so, and just casually work into the conversation. Make a joke about how you got lost and you're just a student or someone else who's visiting, someone they know at the firm, and definitely introduce yourself to as many people as you can. Don't hesitate when you get into these situations where something doesn't go exactly as planned or you have an opportunity to meet people that you didn't originally anticipate. Take advantage of it, meet as many people as you can. Do keep in mind any other time commitments. So if you have another informational interview scheduled, then obviously you don't want to back out of that at the expense of staying there in person and meeting all these new people, but try to be as spontaneous as you can because you never know what kind of opportunities are going to come up as you go on these weekend trips. And then finally, this one's simple, just do it. So again, this concept of taking weekend trips and possibly spending even longer than that in one place, visiting people, doing your networking, going through informational interviews, possibly doing real interviews, may be unfamiliar to you if you haven't seen it or known anyone who's done it before, but don't hesitate. There's always a million reasons not to do something, whether it's poor timing or you have too many classes or too much work or whatever it is. But the truth is, there's not really such a thing as not having time to do something. When you don't have time to do something, that really means that your priorities lie elsewhere. So if you're really serious about getting into finance, you're going to make time and you're going to find the money to do this. And that's all it comes down to. Honestly, I really can't think of a more effective networking strategy than taking these weekend trips and meeting possibly dozens of people in one fell swoop. It's going to make a huge impression. It's going to give you a huge boost in your networking efforts, and you should definitely do it no matter what obstacles you think are standing in the way. So that's a quick overview of how to become a weekend warrior. Coming up next, we're going to look at an example of an email you might send to set up one of these meetings. We'll look at a sample schedule and see how a person might approach it and how they might go through it. And then we're going to look at a sample follow-up email that you might send after having met someone on one of these trips.